It all started on a cool autumn morning when I decided to walk the full stretch of my land, something I hadn't done in a while, as I had been caught up with work and life's usual distractions. But as I made my way through the thick brush and overgrown grass, something in the distance caught my eye. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but as I moved closer, I saw the unmistakable shape of a row of quaint, wood-paneled cottages nestled between the trees, each painted in soft pastel colors, with white fences, potted plants by the porches, and chimneys puffing out thin wisps of smoke, a sight so out of place that I stopped in my tracks, my mind racing with confusion, for I had never authorized any construction on my land, nor had I sold or leased it to anyone. Yet here they stood, 5 perfectly maintained cottages, as if they had always belonged there, prompting me to rush forward, my heart pounding, trying to process the sheer audacity of what I was witnessing. And as I got closer, I could hear the sound of laughter, children playing, and a distant murmur of conversations, the unmistakable signs of a fully occupied and functioning residence, which only deepened my bewilderment, because I had no idea who these people were or how they had come to be living on land that belonged to me. And without thinking, I approached the first cottage, knocking firmly on the wooden door, determined to get answers. But instead of an explanation, I was met with a confused middle-aged woman, who, after hearing my question about who owned the cottages, gave me a puzzled look before saying, "Oh, Karen owns them. She's our landlord," which was the moment my confusion turned into rage, for I didn't know any Karen, nor had I ever given permission for anyone to build, let alone rent out property on my land. So I pressed her for more details, asking how long she had lived there, how much she paid in rent, and if she had any documentation, to which she responded that she had moved in a year ago, paying a reasonable monthly fee directly to Karen, who had advertised the cottages as private rental properties in a peaceful, secluded environment. And at that moment, I realized I was dealing with something far bigger than just a misunderstanding. It was an outright violation of my rights, a blatant theft of my property. And as I stormed towards the other cottages, my mind reeled at the sheer magnitude of what had happened under my nose. And with each tenant I spoke to, the more the pieces of the puzzle started coming together. Each one had signed rental agreements with Karen, paid her rent, and had no idea that she was not the legitimate owner of the land. Some even showing me lease documents with her name on them, all legally binding on the surface, but utterly fraudulent in reality. And as I tried to process how someone could have gone to such lengths to construct, furnish, and rent out cottages on land that was never theirs, I knew I had to confront this Karen. Immediately, and after pressing the tenants, I finally got an address where she supposedly lived, a grand house in town, which only fueled my anger because it meant she had been profiting handsomely from her deceit. So I wasted no time, driving to the address, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. And when I finally arrived at the 2-story house with its manicured lawn and sleek modern exterior, I took a deep breath before knocking, my heart pounding with anticipation. And when the door opened, I was met with a woman in her 50s, immaculately dressed, with short blonde hair and an air of entitlement that I recognized instantly, the kind of person who believed they could do whatever they pleased without consequence. And the moment I told her who I was and demanded an explanation for what she had done, she had the audacity to smirk, as if I was the one being unreasonable, before crossing her arms and saying, I don't know what you're talking about. Those cottages are mine," which sent a shockwave of disbelief through me, because not only was she not denying it, she was claiming ownership of my land right to my face. And as I tried to argue, she cut me off, saying something about squatters' rights and how she had every legal right to be there, which was complete nonsense. But the confidence in her voice made it clear that she had no intention of backing down. And when I threatened legal action, she simply shrugged, saying, "Go ahead, sue me if you want," before slamming the door in my face, leaving me standing there, stunned and seething, knowing that this was far from over, because if she thought she could steal from me and get away with it, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. Furious and determined, I wasted no time in seeking legal counsel, driving straight to the best real estate attorney in town. A seasoned man named Mr. Holloway, whose reputation for dismantling property disputes was unmatched, and the moment I laid out the details of Karen's audacious land grab, he leaned back in his leather chair, exhaling slowly before shaking his head in disbelief, muttering something about how people like her always thought they could outmaneuver the law. But before we could even file the necessary legal documents to reclaim my land, a bombshell dropped that I never saw coming. Karen had beaten me to it, filing a lawsuit against me first, claiming adverse possession, fraud, and harassment, essentially arguing that she had a legal right to the cottages and that I was the one encroaching on her property. A move so brazen that even my attorney had to pause for a moment before chuckling in disbelief, shaking his head as he flipped through the paperwork she had submitted, noting how her claims were flimsy at best, relying on manipulated property records and what appeared to be forged lease agreements that she had undoubtedly concocted to make her case seem legitimate. But while her argument held no real legal standing, it was enough to stall the situation, making it clear that she wasn't just some clueless squatter. She was an experienced con artist who knew exactly how to play the system, and what made matters worse was that the tenants living in those cottages, completely oblivious to the fact that they had been paying rent to a fraud, were now unwittingly siding with her, claiming that I was trying to force them out of their homes, their voices joining Karen's in painting me as a villain, the greedy landowner who wanted to evict innocent families, which quickly turned public sentiment against me, to the point where local news stations even picked up the story, twisting the narrative into some David versus Goliath spectacle, portraying Karen as a struggling businesswoman and me as the wealthy oppressor, which was not only absurd but also infuriating, because the truth was far from that. Yet perception often mattered more than facts, and Karen was playing the role of the victim so well that even some of my own acquaintances started questioning whether I was in the wrong. But I refused to let the lies deter me, instead doubling down on my fight, gathering every piece of evidence I could find: property deeds, historical records, witness statements from my family and neighbors who could confirm that the land had always been mine. And as Mr. Holloway prepared our case, we dug deeper into Karen's history, uncovering disturbing patterns of similar behavior in other towns, instances where she had manipulated legal loopholes, forged documents, and bullied rightful owners into submission, often settling out of court or forcing them to give up in frustration. But this time, she had picked the wrong person to mess with, because I wasn't about to roll over and let her steal what was mine. And as we moved forward with our counter lawsuit, seeking immediate removal of the cottages and full restitution for damages, Karen escalated her tactics, showing up to court with a high-powered lawyer of her own, a slick-talking, sharp-dressed man who knew how to muddy the waters, spinning the case into something far more complicated than it needed to be, challenging every document we presented, claiming that I had no right to evict families who had lived on the property for over a year, and even going as far as to submit fake affidavits from so-called witnesses who attested that Karen had owned the land for years, a desperate but effective tactic that only dragged the case out further, frustrating me beyond belief. Yet despite all the chaos, I refused to back down, pouring every ounce of energy into proving my case, sitting through grueling depositions, attending court hearings that seemed to go nowhere, dealing with media slander that painted me as the aggressor. And yet, the more we pushed forward, the more cracks started to appear in Karen's carefully constructed web of lies, because while she was good at deception, she wasn't perfect, and one by one, the inconsistencies in her story began to unravel. First, it was a mistake in one of her fabricated deeds, a small discrepancy in the dates that contradicted her own timeline. Then it was a former contractor she had hired who came forward revealing that Karen had paid him under the table to build the cottages in secret, telling him that she had full ownership of the land and that no one would ever know. And then, most damning of all, we discovered a forged signature on one of her fake lease agreements, a signature that was meant to be from an official land surveyor, but upon closer examination, turned out to be a poorly executed forgery, a mistake that would ultimately become her undoing. But even as we gathered overwhelming evidence against her, Karen continued to double down, refusing to settle, refusing to admit guilt, and instead, she turned even more aggressive, showing up to court with fake tears, claiming that I was trying to ruin her life, that I was a ruthless capitalist exploiting the legal system to crush a hard-working woman just trying to make a living. And for a brief moment, I almost worried that her theatrics might work, as the judge seemed to be growing weary of the endless back and forth. But then, in a dramatic turn of events, my attorney delivered the final blow, presenting bank records that showed Karen had been collecting rent from tenants and funneling the money into offshore accounts. Evidence that not only proved her fraud beyond any doubt, but also painted a clear picture of just how calculated and malicious her scheme had been. And as the weight of her deception finally became undeniable, I watched as her confident smirk began to falter, her face draining of color, as she realized that she was no longer in control. And in that moment, I knew that I had won, not just the legal battle, but the war. Because no matter how much she lied, no matter how much she manipulated the narrative, the truth had finally caught up to her, and there was no escaping it now. As the final days of the trial approached, the tension in the courtroom was palpable, a suffocating weight pressing down on everyone as both sides prepared for what was sure to be a dramatic conclusion. But despite the months of grueling legal battles, sleepless nights, and public scrutiny that had turned my life into a relentless cycle of stress and frustration, I could sense that the tide was finally turning in my favor, because while Karen had spent the entire case spinning elaborate lies, dodging accountability, and manipulating the system to stall the inevitable, she had made one fatal mistake. She had underestimated just how determined I was to see justice served, and with every passing day, her once unshakable confidence had begun to crumble, her carefully crafted persona of a struggling entrepreneur being eroded by the mountain of damning evidence we had compiled against her. And it all came to a head when we presented the final piece of irrefutable proof, a series of confidential emails we had obtained through legal discovery. Emails that Karen had exchanged with a fraudulent notary who had helped forge the fake deeds and rental agreements. Emails that outlined in explicit detail how she had orchestrated the entire scheme from the very beginning, including how she had manipulated tenants into believing she was the rightful owner, how she had laundered rental payments through shell accounts to avoid detection, and, most incriminating of all, how she had bribed a local property official to bury any paperwork that might have raised red flags about her claims to the land, a revelation so damning that the moment it was read aloud in court, the entire room fell into a stunned silence, the weight of her deception laid bare for all to see. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw real fear in Karen's eyes, a flicker of panic that she quickly tried to suppress. But there was no escaping it now. She was cornered, her lies collapsing around her like a house of cards. And when the judge turned to her, demanding an explanation, all she could do was stammer and deflect, grasping at straws, claiming that the emails were taken out of context, that she had been set up. But it was clear to everyone in that room that the jig was up, and as her lawyer, who up until that moment had been fighting tooth and nail to defend her, quietly leaned over and whispered something in her ear, likely advising her to take a plea deal, I knew that. The victory I had fought so hard for was finally within reach, and sure enough, after a brief recess, when court resumed, Karen's demeanor had changed completely, her arrogance gone, replaced by a quiet, almost defeated expression as she stood before the judge and, in a halting, reluctant voice, admitted to falsifying documents, to illegally occupying land that did not belong to her, to defrauding tenants who had unknowingly been part of her scam, a confession that sent a ripple of shock through the courtroom, even among those who had once sympathized with her. And though she tried to frame it as a misunderstanding, as if she had somehow been forced into committing fraud, the judge was having none of it, his voice cold and unforgiving as he delivered his verdict, ruling in my favor on every single count, ordering Karen to vacate the property immediately, to pay back every cent she had stolen, and to face criminal charges for fraud, perjury, and illegal property dealings, a punishment that was long overdue. And as I sat there, finally hearing the words I had waited so long for, a rush of relief flooded through me, a sense of vindication that I hadn't realized I needed so badly, because while I had always known that I was in the right, that I had been the real victim in this mess, having it recognized in a court of law, having the truth exposed for all to see, was a feeling beyond words. And as I watched Karen being escorted out of the courtroom, her once proud posture now slumped in defeat, I couldn't help but wonder if she had ever truly believed she could get away with it, if she had thought she was untouchable, or if she had simply bet on me giving up, on me not having the stamina to fight her until the bitter end. But if that was the case, she had sorely miscalculated, because I had never been one to back down from a challenge, especially not when my home, my land, my rights were on the line, and though the victory was sweet, the battle had taken its toll, leaving behind scars that would take time to heal. Because while Karen was now facing the consequences of her actions, the damage she had caused wasn't just financial. It was personal. It had turned my life upside down, dragged my name through the mud, made me question the very system that was supposed to protect people like me from predators like her. And yet, as I stepped outside the courthouse that day, breathing in the crisp air, feeling the weight of the ordeal finally begin to lift, I knew that in the end, I had won more than just a legal case. I had won my peace, my justice, my home back, and no one, no scam artist, no manipulator, no Karen, was ever going to take that away from me again.